Cuban Democratic Socialists rip AOC's Democratic Socialists for supporting Cuban regime. You're either ignorant, not socialist, or not democratic. I was very confused by this. How they're both socialists and they're mad at each other for supporting socialism? What do you think Cuba is? What these people don't seem to understand about socialism is that it's a fairy tale. It's a faith. It's not a real thing. There are varying degrees of how economics can work. But let me break down before we get into the story. I'll make it very simple for you. Why socialism doesn't work. Money is a trade medium. That's it. It represents intrinsic value of nothing. It's confidence that you can get something later. In the olden days, the guy who made bread said, I need wheat if I'm going to make my bread. And he would go to the farmer and say, I need some wheat. And the farmer would say, in order to make the wheat, I need a tool, a scythe to cut the wheat. Well, the farmer said, unfortunately, I don't have that. Too bad. So then they'd have to go around this, like, you ever play Zelda where you do that ridiculous trading thing? It's so annoying. Well, eventually, the concept of intrinsic value emerged and currency came to be a placeholder for value. So instead of me having to worry about finding this ridiculous path towards trading, I'd say, I don't got a scythe, but I do have one gold coin, which will get you a scythe from that feller over there. And he'd say, great, thanks for the gold coin. Here's your wheat. I'd go make my bread. Money is just a trade medium. Socialism, this idea that the people will own everything, makes no sense. It's basically saying we want to create a world where there is no trade medium. Let's make an analogy for this. Let's say you are going to build a house, and the socialist says, we don't need central support columns. That's capitalist thinking. And you're like, actually, the central support column is just one small aspect that's not necessarily easy to find because we build around it that holds the thing up. And they refuse. Well, guess what? The house doesn't exist. Here's where it gets better. AOC is essentially somebody who's living in a skyscraper and advocating for the removal of support columns, a trade medium. Now, we can put laws on how currency works, but the idea of trading currency has nothing to do with, I understand there's a lot of people who are going to argue saying like, Tim, you're confusing currency with socialism. Listen, I understand that in many of these socialist places, they have currency, they have trade mediums, but talk to the socialists online and listen to what they're claiming about you can just go get healthcare. You can just go to school. Or in my specific circumstance, when I was arguing with the Great Britain socialists, and they said you would just walk to the car factory and get whatever material you wanted just by asking for it. You're right. They're advocating for no money. And the socialists I've talked to, it's a common theme. Now, it's possible to have socialism and have a trade medium because they do believe in what's called personal property. But the whole thing kind of falls apart because where does personal property end and where does private property begin? None of it makes sense, and you're basically advocating for pulling out support columns from a house, and it's going to collapse on you, and it does every single time. So the only way this works is if when a bunch of people rise up and say, if you pull out those support columns, we will revolt. And then the communist or socialist leader says, take them out. And they throw them out the back. And then they say, now that the troublemakers are gone, we can rip down these support columns, then everything falls down on you. Let's read the story and see exactly why the Cubans are mad now that you've dealt with my anti-communism rant. But I will say, I have a photo, apparently, of the socialists, the Cubans, arguing with Ocasio Cortez. I'm kidding, by the way. For those that are listening, it's the Spider-Man meme. They're both pointing at each other. How are you going to be upset that AOC is supporting Cuba when you literally dealt with what socialism does and you think it's going to be better somewhere else? What an absurdly stupid story. 9 Cuban Democratic Socialists, let me interject, who learned nothing from Cuba, wrote a blistering open letter condemning American Democratic Socialists, such as AOC, Rashida Tlaib, blasting the Democratic Socialists of America, a group both women belong to, for their support of Cuba's communist government. The 9 Cubans writing the letter stated that the American Democratic Socialists either did not know the Cuban reality or they are not socialist or democratic, calling them poorly informed. The Blaze reported of the letter in which the 9 Cubans wrote, the support for Castroism revealed in Resolution 62 of the recent convention of the Democratic Socialists of the United States held in Atlanta, Georgia, can only be explained by two reasons. Either the American Socialist Democrats do not know the Cuban reality, or they're not socialist or democratic. Or more importantly, they are, and you haven't learned. Let me flip this on you. Perhaps AOC and Tlaib know exactly what Cuba is and what they're doing, authoritarianism, and they support it. And you, who somehow managed to still be a democratic socialist after experiencing Castroism, for some reason defend it? I think AOC's right on this one. I got to be honest. Democratic socialism would absolutely support Cuban communism. They do. How, it's quite silly. Be it resolved, the DSA formally declares itself in solidarity with the Cuban socialist struggle. The DSA unequivocally condemns the economic blockade imposed on Cuba by the United States and its allies, the American military presence in Guantanamo Bay, and any sanctions and actions that would undermine the self-determination of the Cuban people. Be it further resolved, the DSA will move to join the National Network on Cuba, an American progressive organization dedicated to opposing acts of imperialist aggression against the Republic of Cuba. Be it finally resolved, within 30 days after passing, the DSA will submit its application for full membership to the National Network on Cuba and will take active measures to pursue full membership status. Bravo, DSA. They're for open borders. They have that. Remember that weird video where it was like they say their names and their pronouns, and then everyone got really angry, and the guy was like, "Stop muttering! You are giving me anxiety." And then someone else went up was like, "Don't use gendered language." Well, is it a surprise to anybody, these people who are trying to dictate what anyone else can do, or authoritarians who support Cuba? Think about it. At a convention, a guy says, "Can everyone stop chattering?" Then someone else said, "Don't say guys, don't use gendered pronouns." That's what it's all about. They want you to do what they want you. They want you to bend the knee. So they look at Cuba and they say, "Wow, Cuba sure made people bend over backwards." God, they love that authoritarianism, don't they? The open letter continues its attack. You have been in solidarity with a regime maintained by force of arms, murder, imprisonment, repression, and compulsory exile of the opponents, which has not held free and democratic elections for more than 60 years, which systematically violates massive and blatantly the civil, political... Okay, you know what? No. We get it. You can't have democratic socialism. It literally makes no sense. Because what happens when people vote for self-interest? It all comes crumbling down. Laissez-faire capitalism is the far-right economic spectrum. Communism or socialism is the far left. Neither can function properly. And here come all of the libertarians being like, and ANCAPs, "Tim, you're wrong. Free market will work." Okay, dude. Okay. Let's talk about market incentives. Human dopamine triggering, environmental destruction, lying. There's a lot. You can't have a complete free market, and you can't have socialism. I'm not saying we can't have a very free market. That's why I said ANCAP, anarcho-capitalists. Because in an anarcho-capitalist system, I mean, things get silly. And monopolies form rapidly, and you devolve into authoritarianism really, really quickly. But you can have very light regulation with an overwhelmingly free market. I actually lean towards a mixed economy, more closer to the middle. But you've got to have some laws, some restrictions. There's got to, because a society can't function if you allow sociopaths to exploit and extract resources. And to an extent, we have that problem. But we do have regulations, we do adapt, and we are solving for it. It won't work forever. On the far left, all the way at the end, you have socialism. It doesn't work either. You have no choice but to enforce this with guns. And you can't allow elections because people will vote for dopamine. They're not going to vote for their best interest, and necessarily. I shouldn't put it that way. That was poorly framed. What I mean to say is they will vote for their best interest. That's what I mean to say. They won't vote for a collective, long-term view of what they need to do. They're going to think about, as individuals, what will make our lives better, and it's not being forced into this at gunpoint. It's not eating crappy food. It's not allowing you to exile people. So let me reframe. People always vote in their best interests. That doesn't always mean it's the best thing for the community. What this brings me to is why I believe mixed economy and more moderate policy makes the most sense. We need to protect the collective, that is the United States, that is a bit nationalist, but we also need we also need to recognize that competition helps. So it is a complicated problem. You cannot have nothing but competition, and you cannot have nothing but cooperative systems. It doesn't function. If you want to force people to live a certain way without money or whatever, you got to do it at gunpoint. If you want to just let people trade whatever they want, eventually people start trading drugs. They do ridiculous things. I mean, look, I can't get into it because YouTube I'll get in trouble. The point is, there's a decent mix. You can have social democracy where you have like a 60, 70% tax rate. I think that's too much, but it does work. It does function. Some people eventually get angry. They vote against it. Things can change. You can also have a more libertarian type government with very light taxation or near no taxation and small regulations to make sure you prevent like a company from putting, lead shavings in their drink that kills you, and then no one can do anything about it. There's got to be some laws and some regulations. Now, I know people on the far right, libertarian economic spectrum will say like NAP and stuff. Like, yeah, I get it, man. But listen, I think a good mix is healthy. The problem is, this is what you get when you have a bunch of young idealistic individuals who have no idea what it truly means to be socialist. And for some reason, you have socialists who are shocked that socialists would support socialism. You know what? Whatever. I got one more segment coming up in a few minutes, and I will see you all shortly.